Is Florida State actually out recruiting Alabama?
You are Locked On Seminoles, your daily podcast on the Florida State Seminoles, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What a new staff can or cannot do. That's what today's episode is all about. Hi, my name is Brian Smith, and this is Locked On Seminoles. Florida State is absolutely out recruiting Alabama, and it's due to consistency, proper evaluations, and quite frankly, unlike Alabama, Florida State is not dropping the ball with top prospects. You can find this podcast wherever you get your pods and on YouTube, part of the awesome Locked On Network, your team every single day. And today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off of your next purchase. So let's just break down what I'm talking about. Alabama hired Kalen DeBoer, and he's a heck of a head coach. Not debating that. They just took that staff, or at least a large chunk of it, brought it to Alabama from the University of Washington after their runner-up finish in last year's playoff. Here's the problem. Not only is that a West Coast group, and it's difficult to adapt to the Southeast. You couldn't get a whole lot different than the greater Seattle area in the state of Alabama. That's polar opposite. But at the same time, it still comes down to effort. While Florida State consistently chips away at recruits in the state of Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, etc., Alabama walked into a situation, and the new staff at Alabama, where they had some commitments that were really good, that were coveted by the Noles and everybody else, and didn't even call them. Or they did very little. And there are 2026 prospects as well that Alabama's completely failed to recruit in their own state that are elite prospects. What in the hell are you doing? It's ridiculous. Alabama should never be in that situation. And again, to be clear, I know DeBoer can coach, but as Kirby Smart recently said, players, elite talent, will beat coaching 9 out of 10 times. That's just bottom line. Michigan had better players than Washington. Michigan beat Washington. Not that Harbaugh couldn't coach, but some of his defensive linemen, some of his defensive players were too much for Washington to overcome. Recruiting. If you're going to win in this league, the SEC, which Alabama is in, you got to figure that out. In Florida State, which it might be in the SEC soon based on the Grant Wright situation, I'll get into that later this week. They're recruiting in a way that SEC teams like Alabama under Saban used to. Proper evaluations. They make sure they don't take kids too early. Some of their prior staffs took kids they shouldn't have, especially early in the process. And Florida State has figured it out in terms of how to evaluate their own way. They don't care about recruiting rankings. And here's the greatest example of all. This is one of the best stories in college football, period. Quindarius Jones, Meridian, Mississippi. It's a program that's always had players. His only Power 5, Florida State. His only offer listed on 247, Florida State. And he came in last year and performed. Matter of fact, he played in 10 games. He had a blocked field goal for a touchdown, had 6 tackles and a tackle for loss, and playing in 10 games in a loaded Florida State secondary. 6'1.5", can play corner, can play safety, can play different roles. He could be a nickel at some point. I think he has an NFL future. Florida State was the one that recruited him. Florida State was the one that offered him, and Florida State is the one that put him in the lineup when nobody else believed in him. That's the definition of successful recruiting. If you do that consistently, you build a top program. Sure, you still need 5-star kids, but when you take a chance on a kid like Quindarius, you have to hit. Otherwise, you're wasting a scholarship. Florida State, in conjunction, has done similar things with kids from the portal that other schools didn't think were that great. They took them and they've coached them up. Give them props. I'm not saying that Washington staff didn't do that before they came to Bama. We don't have any evidence of them with the portal yet. But at the same time, if they're dropping the ball with in-state recruiting and Alabama's loaded with prospects, I'm not hopeful. Something is goofy there, and I don't know what this is. So let me explain where I'm at here. I followed Florida State for a very long time, and I know that they consistently do a good job with recruiting with this staff. Last staff, no. This staff definitely. Since they've been there, they've been very consistent on what they've tried to do. Haven't closed on enough kids, I don't think. But this last class was the breakthrough, and the way I'm seeing 25, all the kids are in on, it's going to be another top 10 class. I've said that before. I'll say it again today. Alabama, however, I don't think that's a top 10 program right now because Saban left. A lot of guys, obviously, off his staff are no longer there. Back office is not the same. They're unorganized. And I've heard over and over and over that they are failing with in-state prospects. Hell, if you can't get the kids inside the state of Alabama, why would I feel comfortable about you getting kids that are outside in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, or Florida, etc.? That doesn't make sense. Something is goofy. So we're seeing a big shift in college football. The proof is in the pudding on signing day, and there's a long way to go, and maybe Alabama rights the ship. I don't know. But this is not my info. This is people around the program. This is people at high schools where the prospects are. These are prospects themselves. This is unsolicited information coming to me because I work in the recruiting industry. It is really bizarre. In my lifetime, I've never heard these kind of things about Alabama under any staff. I've heard it over and over again in a couple of months. Again, I don't cover Alabama, and I'm getting this. That is a bizarre scenario to me. What in the hell are they doing in Tuscaloosa? Honestly, I have no idea. I have not heard one person say they're recruiting well across the board, doing the things you should do behind the scenes. And for those of you who say, oh, they got some really good commitments, they do. It's Alabama. You can roll out the ball and get certain kids to commit. But they've had commitments already walking in the door that they didn't call, that they should have, or they've got kids in the class of 26 that they haven't really approached that everybody else has, in-state and otherwise, and Alabama has failed. I have also heard once again that they are not doing a very good job with communication overall in depth in their house. Inside your office, you got to know what's going on. Everybody's got to agree. Right now, I've heard that's not the case, again, from multiple people. So Florida State setting the trend with recruiting doesn't mean they're all automatically going to figure it out and get 10 commitments in the next 2-3 weeks. They're at the point of the year like everybody else when the commitments are going to start to flow. The Noles have a handful of commitments right now, like most schools. In between now and the middle of June, they'll get 10 or more commitments. That's just kind of how it works. But I'm more concerned about their evaluations and their fit based on what they've done to this point compared to Alabama, which used to be the standard. And quite frankly, it is no longer. Until otherwise proven, Alabama for me is way down the list. I don't like what I'm hearing, and I don't understand it either. It's really, really bizarre. This should never, ever happen at Alabama, but it is. If you don't like it, then go do something about it. If you were doing great, I'd tell you. I don't care one way or the other about Alabama. I'm not a fan. I'm not a hater. I just reporting the news. But it's interesting that Florida State, the team that I cover, is going out of their way to figure it out, being consistent in the state of Alabama, where they'll probably get 1 or 2 kids, and they're being consistent across the South. They do their own due diligence, and that matters. Here's something else that's interesting when talking about this. If you look at how Florida State built their 22, 23, and 24 classes, camps and combines, mega camps, in-person evaluations, getting kids to campus over and over again to build relationships, that word that I use all the time on this show, relationships, it's the number one word in recruiting, is how they've done it. Whether it's a Miami kid, whether it's a kid from the middle of the sticks in Georgia, whatever it may be, they've done it with relationships. How is Alabama doing that when they don't even communicate with certain players? Well, of course, that's pretty basic, and that's an obvious answer. They're not. Again, it should never happen at Alabama. Just wanted to bring that up. And before I go on to the next section here, I'm going to talk about top programs in college football. I've talked about recently where Florida State's at, and I think it's a pretty easy guide to go by. They're top 10 in the country as a program, very conservatively. But are they top 5? That's going to be next here on Locked On Seminoles. All right. Next up, FanDuel. It's time for the playoffs in the NBA, the NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on each game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. Bet on anything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in the app that's safe, secure, and easy to use. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So where would you have placed, before Saban left, Alabama's program in terms of just the program itself, like in a ranking? Not a 2024 poll where they were going to be top 5, as a program. 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in there is pretty much what everybody would say. Most people are going to pick Georgia, myself included. I think that's a slam dunk. But anywhere really 2 to 4 is safe. I'm doing a list right now, and I went through a bunch of stats and looked at things. I don't know where to put Alabama. I don't even know if after what I just talked about a moment ago, should Alabama be in the top 10? And 2-3 years ago, I would have said the same thing about Florida State, and it probably would have been no. It's just amazing to me how teams switch around. Because if you don't recruit well, especially in your own backyard, and Alabama is not doing its due diligence, then you're not being an effective program. Again, if you don't recruit your own backyard well, it doesn't end well. That's it. There is no exception to that. Nobody's getting their butt kicked in their own state and turning around and being a top 3, top 4 program. If you want to talk about up to this point, it's a top 3 program. It's not even in question. What Saban did there is phenomenal. It's historical. It's something that many dissertations will be written about, books, etc., talk shows, you name it. This is not about Saban. It's about now moving forward. That's it. Mike Norvell and his staff, on the other hand, they figured it out because they do their own evaluations, and this is how I have it, and you can grade it yourself. This is only based on how they've recruited the last couple of years, how they're recruiting now, and how much confidence I have in talent acquisition, coaching development. Like I talked about earlier with Quindarius Jones at Florida State, he played immediately, even though they had an elite secondary in terms of talent, and the production showed it. And really just like the momentum of the program is everybody bought in. So this is what I've got. You can take it for however you want. And I'll bring up the Alabama question in a moment. This is my original list. And then my second one is like, where would it be if things were better? So take it for what it's worth. I got Georgia 1, Ohio State 2, Texas 3. I really don't think those 3 are all that debatable. Head coaches are entrenched, recruiting at an elite level, and they have a really good opportunity with the portal this year. Any of those 3, those are the best bets by far to win the national title right now. That being stated, there are a few teams that are kind of on that cusp. You can take it however you want. I got Florida State as a program. Again, this is about program, not the 2024 season. This is not a 2024 poll. I got Florida State 4th, LSU 5th, Notre Dame 6th, Oregon 7th, Penn State 8th, Clemson 9, Utah 10. That was my original list. Then I'm going through and I'm like, well, Michigan's not there, but they have a really weird deal. Like they lost their entire defensive staff. They got a new head coach, a guy that's got no experience. I have no idea how to rank them. The recruiting's good. They could be a top 10 team just based on talent, but are they going to stay there under Sharon Moore? I have no idea. I have no opinion on their program. Bama on the other side, another program with a new head coach, but he comes again all the way from Seattle down here. And he's a West Coast guy. Should they be 5? Like they do have a lot of talent left from what Saban left, although some did leave and go to the portal. And they got a good recruiting class that he's walking into. How do I grade them, though, based on what I said in the first segment? If you take out that, they're number 3 to number 6 at worst. Probably, like I said earlier, 2 to 4. But right now, I don't even have them in my top 10. The reason, again, I don't have faith if you don't recruit your own backyard. If anybody wants to argue about that, shoot a message on YouTube and let's talk about it. But why would I be confident, and why would you that program is going to be there? And why wouldn't I put Florida State, LSU, other schools that are recruiting at an elite level in terms of their long-term valuations, 3-star kids making it, etc., in development? Look at Brian Thomas at LSU last year, the receiver. He ends up running a 4.33 at the combine. He led the nation, I believe, in touchdown receptions. He was a guy that was not that great, and he got better and better. Ends up being a potential NFL first-round pick. Florida State, Keon Coleman took him. He was already really good, but they made him an elite player who dominated, ironically, against LSU in game 1 is the reason the Noles won. They're finding different players and finding different ways to make them win, whether they were the guy or they weren't, because they got good coaching staffs on both those schools. That's why I got them right on that cusp. I trust those coaching staffs now that Kelly's made some defensive staff changes. In Baton Rouge, I think they'll be good long-term. But at the same time, I just don't feel that way about Alabama. I really don't. Just for fun, just to talk about some of the other schools here. A lot of people have different opinions of Notre Dame, but they've recruited so well and they're so consistent. Their quarterback room is now elite. They got Deuce Knight coming in. That program is going to be top 10 every single year. Oregon, my only concern with them, they've done a really good job of recruiting. They've hit some portal things. Ironically, Kalen DeBoer flat out recruited Dan Lanning and his staff in those 2 games. Oregon was better. They were favored by almost 10 points, I believe, in the second round. Now, when they played, they got outcoached. I'm worried about game day there. And that's the same thing with Penn State. If you don't know that the Penn State staff has struggled on game days, then you haven't watched college football. But they've recruited well. They're really invested. They want to be there. It's a great environment. It's a great place. And they've got resources out the yin-yang. Penn State's got money. So any facilities, coaching, salaries, anything like that, I think that's a pretty easy one. The bizarre one outside of Alabama is Clemson. You know what I'm going to say. When are they going to use the portal? That's why I got them down at number 9. There's no reason Clemson with Dabo, who's an excellent head coach in general, especially game day, is this low. But it's his own fault. Until he starts using the portal, they will not sniff a national title again. Will not. And when I say use it, I mean willingly, openly, preparing for it year-round. This is what we're doing. Right now, he hates it. He won't do it. Prove me wrong. I say they have zero shot at a national title until they do it. Prove me wrong. And then finally, Utah, I just think that's a hell of a program. They have, out of all the schools I just mentioned, by far, they don't have the resources that Florida State does just based on location. How many recruits are that close to Salt Lake City as compared to Tallahassee? It's not any comparison. Within 6-hour radius of Tallahassee, they get everything they want and more. That's not even counting the Miami area, which they get. You can't get to Miami in 6 hours. So you have to look at it from a different perspective if you're Florida State and how they allocate NIL or something. You can compare that, but Utah's not trying to do that either. They outcoach teams. They recruit to their system, and I think it's the most underrated program in the country. If you don't like it, again, feel free to comment on Utah, but I think the Utes do a tremendous job. And to be honest, I don't think that many people can argue because they beat teams with a lot better recruits year in and year out. Coming up next, going to talk a little bit about what's next for Florida State to finalize this recruiting stuff that I just mentioned, why they're out recruiting Alabama, how do I think it's going to come to fruition, and when. That's next on Locked on Seminoles. Game time. If you ever had an opportunity to go to a game last minute, but you check the ticket prices, and you're like, yeah, not so much. This guy right here is one of those. A couple years ago, I did have an opportunity, and I used Game Time, and I got an opportunity to get a ticket a little cheaper, and I went to the game. It cost me $100 instead of $150 on another app. Can't go wrong with that. So if you want to get last-minute ticket prices, you want to get zone deals, you want to get an opportunity to go on an app, make a couple of clicks, type in Florida State football, for instance, you could pick a seat. It will show you, literally show you, this is the view from where you're standing or sitting and looking down at the stage at a concert, a football game, whatever it may be, you can do it. Again, this is not just sports. This is an opportunity to go to concerts. You could go to an opera. You could go to many different things like a play, and you could use Game Time. So with that being said, don't take the opportunity to always wait at the last second. But if it comes up, they have those for you. And if you plan ahead, you could probably even get more good deals with Game Time. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem Locked On College. That's LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So what does Florida State have to do to finalize what I've been talking about in this show? And I'm sure some people are like, well, Florida State's only got a few commitments. That's not what it's about. Florida State has proven over the last couple of years they knew how to take kids, regardless of their ranking, and put them into the lineup and gain results. That's recruiting personified. Bottom line. And that's why they're out recruiting Alabama, and that's why they're a program on the rise, and that's why I had them top 5 in my programs list. Again, this is not a poll that I just talked about, how they are as a program long-term moving forward. So Florida State, the next couple of weeks are big. Got the spring game coming up, got a bunch of unofficial visits, you got a bunch of visits that have just been taken, and there's also the chance to flip kids. Florida State's the most consistent program, arguably, in the South, just being steady and being consistent. If a kid flips from them, they still recruit them. If they flip a kid, they still recruit them. They go after kids the same way. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of like how Michigan used to recruit under Bo Schembechler or something like that, just really ardent and be consistent. They always had really good teams. Bowden was that way to a certain degree. Lou Holtz at Notre Dame. Teams that were always in top 10 in the 80s and 90s. This Florida State staff reminds me of some of those guys that I grew up watching. And I think it's a really good sign for Florida State now because recruiting is more volatile. So again, you got visits coming up, some that just happened, and a ton of OVs as well. The visits part I'm talking about are unofficial. The OVs will really start at the end of this month. There'll be a few, handful in May, and then a ton in June. Between now and that time, I think Florida State's going to end up, say, by July 1st, give or take, somewhere around 15 commitments at top end. Probably 10 to 12 is the more likely number, but it wouldn't be shocking if it was more because, again, they're recruiting a lot of kids in state, South Georgia, South Alabama, and they got a shot. Here are a few kids just in general to bring up. Zion Grady is a kid from Enterprise, Alabama. They would love to have. That's a possibility. Coming up here soon, another kid from South Alabama, Alvin Henderson, is going to make a decision. He's not going to pick Florida State, but I will guarantee you the Florida State continues to recruit him. It's going to be Auburn or Penn State, maybe Miami. But Florida State has been in this position before, and I trust the staff based on what they've done to continue. This is the important part here, to continue to stay on him and try to flip it. They don't freak out when they lose somebody. You're not going to win every recruiting battle. And in fact, you're going to lose more than you win. It is competitive. Finally, and this is my parting shot before I wrap up, Florida State's probably going to get a couple of kids based on how they had this past season. They went 13-0 before the bowl game. Kids are going to believe in Florida State a little bit more. When you show it on the field, it accentuates everything I've talked about in this show with the parameters that I talked about. Evaluations, staying on kids, camps, relationships. Florida State has done it the right way. When you do it the right way, you will get more and more dividends each and every year. You can be less reliant on the transfer portal, meaning you just take the elite kids, and you can be more reliant on the high school kids and develop them from the time they walk on campus as an 18-year-old until they leave as a 22 or 23-year-old. That's the difference in being a good program and being an elite one. Just getting one or two more of those key guys at D tackle, like they obviously underachieved at linebacker. That's something they need to do better. I would be surprised if they don't sign 2 or 3 really good linebackers in this class. That's part of recruiting each and every day. And Florida State, I would imagine, is going to end up with a top 10 class conservatively, probably top 7 or 8. That's just my take on it. You can put your own spin on it however you want. Comment on YouTube, give a review, etc., and you can give me all your thoughts on it. And I'm sure Alabama fans are going to come in here and just screaming, but you all going down. And unless something changes, Alabama's in some trouble. That's just the way it is. Florida State's on the rise. Bama's coming down. If anybody has any other questions, please let me know. And if you have any comments, I'd love to hear them on YouTube. But please like and subscribe to this podcast and share it wherever you can. And I will talk to you all very soon.